Why was the entire royal pack kneeling before a maid? The question seemed impossible, yet inside the great hall of Blackwood Palace, hundreds of powerful werewolves had lowered themselves in complete silence. At the center of the marble floor stood Emily Carter, a 26-year-old Omega in a simple gray maid uniform, her long chestnut brown hair falling neatly behind her shoulders. She looked nothing like royalty. She wore no crown, no jewels, and no ceremonial gown. Her hands were empty except for the small silver pendant resting against her collar. Across the hall, Damian Blackwood, the 34-year-old King Alpha, remained standing beneath the enormous silver banners of the royal pack. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his tailored black suit reflecting the warm light of the crystal chandeliers, and his gray eyes remained fixed on Emily. He was the only person in the hall who had not lowered himself. Jason Whitmore stood several feet away, staring at Emily with an expression that had lost all of its earlier confidence. 3 weeks ago, he had laughed when she entered this same hall carrying a cleaning cloth. 3 weeks ago, everyone had believed she was invisible. Now nobody dared look away. Emily slowly raised her eyes toward Damian. There was no triumph in her expression. No arrogance. Only quiet uncertainty, as if she herself could barely understand how the room had reached this moment. Damian took one step forward. The royal pack remained silent. He looked at the ancient silver seal beneath the throne, then back at Emily, as though trying to connect two pieces of a puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight. "Tell me," he said calmly, "who are you?" Emily's fingers closed around the pendant. Before she could answer, the scene seemed to return to a different morning, 3 weeks earlier, when nobody knew her name. Emily had arrived at Blackwood Palace before sunrise, just as she had every day since accepting the maid's position. The palace stretched across acres of carefully maintained grounds, its stone walls glowing beneath the pale morning light. Inside, polished marble floors reflected the chandeliers overhead, while servants moved quietly through corridors lined with royal portraits. Emily preferred the quiet hours. Before the nobles arrived, she could work without being noticed. She polished silver, arranged linens, and cleaned the long dining room table while the palace slowly awakened around her. To the royal pack, she was simply another maid. That was exactly what she wanted them to believe. But that morning, everything changed when she was assigned to clean the area beside the royal throne. Jason Whitmore entered with several council members, speaking confidently about an upcoming royal ceremony. He noticed Emily and stopped. "You should not be standing there," he said. Emily looked up. "I was asked to clean the rail, sir." Jason glanced toward the throne. "Then clean it and remember where you belong." A few people smiled. Emily lowered her eyes and continued working. She did not argue. She did not apologize. But as she wiped the silver rail, her gaze briefly fell upon the ancient royal seal beneath the throne. She froze. Something was wrong with it. She knew it immediately. And that was the first moment the king began to notice the maid everyone else had overlooked. The next morning, Emily returned to the palace before sunrise, carrying the same small cleaning basket she had carried every day since arriving at Blackwood Palace. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had stood beneath the royal throne and noticed something no one else had seen. She wore the same simple gray maid uniform, her long chestnut brown hair neatly tied behind her shoulders, and her expression remained calm and reserved. Yet the palace felt different. The previous morning had left a strange tension in the air, and Emily could feel it in the way servants lowered their voices whenever she passed. She ignored the whispers and continued with her routine. She polished the silver railings, arranged fresh linens, and prepared the dining room before the royal council arrived. For most people, these tasks were invisible. Emily preferred them that way. She had spent years learning how to move quietly through important places without becoming part of the conversation. Attention had never brought her anything good. By 8 o'clock, the palace was fully awake. Members of the royal pack crossed the eastern corridor in formal clothing, discussing the upcoming council meeting. Emily stepped aside whenever they approached, keeping her eyes lowered. Then she noticed Damian Blackwood at the opposite end of the corridor. The King Alpha was walking with two senior council members, listening to their conversation with his usual controlled expression. He stopped when he saw her. Emily immediately returned her attention to the silver railing. Damian said nothing. He simply watched for a moment before continuing down the corridor. Emily waited until he was gone before taking a slow breath. She did not understand why he kept noticing her. She had done nothing to attract his attention. Or at least, that was what she wanted to believe. Later that morning, Emily was assigned to the royal library. It was one of the quietest rooms in the palace, filled with old books, leather-bound records, and historical documents that few servants were permitted to touch. She was dusting a high wooden shelf when she noticed a familiar symbol carved into the corner of an ancient cabinet. A crescent surrounded by 3 small stars. Her hand stopped. The symbol had been part of her childhood, although she had not seen it in years. She remembered her grandmother's warning. Never speak about the old family outside the house. Emily slowly stepped away from the cabinet. Then she heard footsteps. Damian entered the library alone. His gaze moved across the shelves before settling on her. "You recognize that symbol," he said. Emily kept her expression neutral. "It is an old royal emblem." Damian walked closer. "Most people would not know that." Emily looked at the cabinet again. "Most people do not spend their lives reading history." Damian studied her carefully. "Who taught you?" Emily hesitated. "My grandmother." He seemed to consider the answer. "And what did she teach you?" Emily lowered her eyes. "Enough to know when something should remain forgotten." Damian's expression changed slightly. He did not press her. Instead, he looked toward the old cabinet. "Some things are forgotten because they are unimportant." He paused. "Others are forgotten because someone wanted them forgotten." Emily looked at him. For the first time, she wondered whether the King Alpha already suspected that her quiet life inside the palace was not what it seemed. Outside the library, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Emily returned to her work, but her hands were no longer steady. Someone had begun searching for the truth. And she feared they might find it before she was ready. The following morning, Emily was assigned to the royal study, where the morning light fell across a long mahogany desk covered with documents. She had entered quietly, intending to dust the shelves and leave before anyone noticed her. Then she saw the parchment lying beneath a silver paperweight. It was an agreement concerning several northern territories, written in formal royal language and stamped with the seal of the royal council. Emily stopped. She had seen documents like this before, although no one in the palace knew it. Her eyes moved across the first page. The language was careful, almost flawless. Then she reached the final section. Her expression changed. One sentence appeared harmless, but it altered the authority granted to the appointed administrator. Emily leaned closer. The agreement claimed that the administrator served at the king's discretion, then quietly stated that the appointment would remain valid until the council chose to end it. Those two conditions could not exist together. Emily whispered, "That clause changes everything." "Does it?" The voice behind her made her turn. Damian stood in the doorway. Emily immediately stepped away from the desk. "Your Majesty." Damian walked toward the document. "You were reading it." "I was only looking." "Then tell me what you saw." Emily hesitated. She knew the safest answer would be silence, but the document was too important to ignore. She pointed to the final section. "This clause gives the council authority over the appointment after the king approves it. The earlier section says the appointment remains under your authority. If you sign this, the council could interpret the second clause as permanent." Damian read the passage twice. His expression remained calm, but his attention sharpened. "How did you notice that?" Emily looked toward the tall windows. The wording is inconsistent. Most people would not notice. Most people do not read royal contracts. Damien looked at her. Who taught you? Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of her gray apron. My grandmother. Before Damien could ask another question, the study doors opened. Jason Whitmore entered with 2 council members carrying additional records. His confident expression changed when he saw Emily standing beside the royal agreement. What is she doing here? Jason asked. Damien answered calmly. She found a problem with your agreement. Jason looked at Emily and gave a doubtful smile. She is a maid. Emily lowered her eyes, but Damien did not. That is not an explanation. Jason stepped toward the desk. Perhaps she misunderstood the language. Emily looked at the document again. I did not. Jason's expression tightened. Then explain it. Emily took a breath. She knew this was exactly the moment she had spent years trying to avoid. Still, she pointed to the disputed sentence. If this agreement is approved as written, the council could appoint an administrator without requiring the king's continued approval. That changes the balance of authority. One of the council members reached for the document. Damien stopped him with a quiet gesture. Is she correct? The council member read the clause carefully. His expression slowly changed. Yes. The room fell silent. Jason looked from the document to Emily. For the first time, he was not looking at her as a servant. He was looking at her as a problem he did not understand. Damien turned toward Emily. Where did you learn royal law? Emily met his eyes. I already told you. My grandmother taught me. Damien studied her for a long moment. Then I think it is time I learned who your grandmother was. Emily said nothing. Beneath her uniform, the old silver pendant rested against her heart, carrying a family secret that had remained hidden for years. And now, for the first time, someone powerful enough to uncover it had started asking the right questions. Jason Whitmore did not answer immediately. He stood beside the study door with the 2 council members behind him, his expression carefully controlled, but Emily noticed the change in his eyes. He had entered expecting to deliver documents to the king. Instead, he had found a maid standing beside a royal agreement and explaining a flaw that could affect the balance of the kingdom. Damien placed the parchment on the desk. You brought this agreement to me yesterday. Jason nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. It was prepared for your review. Damien looked at him. And you believed the wording was correct? Absolutely. Damien turned toward Emily. She found the contradiction almost immediately. Jason glanced at Emily. She is a maid. Damien's expression remained calm. That does not answer my question. The study fell quiet. Emily stood beside the desk, keeping her hands folded in front of her. She could feel the direction of every gaze in the room. Jason looked at her again. Perhaps she has simply memorized a few phrases. Emily said nothing. Damien asked, is that what happened? Emily met his eyes. No, her answer was simple. Jason frowned. Then prove it. Damien looked at him. Careful. Jason straightened. I only want the truth. Emily understood the trap. If she said too much, the palace would begin asking questions she was not prepared to answer. If she said too little, Jason would dismiss everything she knew as coincidence. She looked at the document. The agreement uses 2 different definitions of royal authority. That is not a mistake someone makes by accident. One of the council members leaned over the parchment. She is right. Jason's expression hardened with concern. Damien remained focused on Emily. Where did you learn this? I studied royal history. Where? Emily hesitated. Before I came here. And what did you study before becoming a maid? Emily looked toward the tall windows. Beyond them, the palace garden stretched beneath the afternoon sun. She remembered a much smaller home, shelves filled with old books, and her grandmother sitting beside a wooden table, teaching her that history was often written by whoever remained in power. Ancient law, Emily finally said. Jason gave a quiet laugh. A maid studying ancient law? Emily looked back at him. There is nothing unusual about reading. Damien's eyes remained on her. You recognized the old emblem in the library. You understood this agreement. You know details that even some council members have forgotten. Emily lowered her gaze. Knowledge does not belong to one social class. The word seemed to surprise everyone. Damien stepped away from the desk. Then perhaps the council should test that knowledge. Jason looked toward him. Your Majesty. Tomorrow morning, Damien said, Emily will appear before the royal council. Emily's heart sank. That was exactly what she had feared. A public examination meant attention, and attention meant questions. Jason seemed satisfied again. That should settle this. Damien looked at Emily. Unless you object. Emily considered the room, the old seal, and the pendant hidden beneath her uniform. She could walk away from the test, but she knew what would happen afterward. People would continue believing Jason's version of her. She slowly shook her head. I will answer their questions. Damien nodded. Then tomorrow, you will have the opportunity to show them what you know. Emily left the study that evening with a strange feeling in her chest. She had entered the palace hoping to remain invisible. Now the entire royal council was preparing to look directly at her. And somewhere beneath the layers of forgotten history, Emily knew there was one truth they were not ready to discover. The next morning, Emily entered the great hall with the same quiet steps she used every day, but nothing about the room felt ordinary anymore. The long marble floor stretched beneath the crystal chandeliers, the royal council sat in a raised semicircle, and Damien Blackwood watched from the center of the royal platform. Emily wore her simple gray maid uniform, her chestnut brown hair neatly tied back, and the small silver pendant remained hidden beneath her collar. Jason Whitmore stood beside the council table with several ancient documents arranged before him. Emily Carter, he said, you have claimed knowledge of royal history and ancient law. Today, the council will determine whether that knowledge is genuine. Emily looked at him calmly. I understand. The first document was placed before her. Identify this agreement. Emily read the opening lines. Fourth Royal Era. Northern Territory Accord. A council member raised an eyebrow. How did you recognize the period? Emily pointed to the wording. The succession language changed after the Winter Accord. This agreement uses the earlier form. Jason placed a second document beside it. And this one? Emily studied it for a moment. Later period. The authority clause was rewritten after the council reforms. Several council members exchanged glances. Jason's expression remained composed. You are certain? Yes. He placed a third document in front of her. Then identify the error. Emily leaned closer. The parchment looked authentic. The handwriting was old. The seal appeared genuine. But something was wrong. She examined the signature, then the date. The signature belongs to King Edward Carter. Jason smiled. Correct. Emily looked up. But the document is false. The smile disappeared. Explain. King Edward abdicated 3 years before this date. The historian immediately reached for an old record. He checked the archive reference, then looked at Damien. She is correct. A murmur moved through the hall. Jason remained silent for several seconds before placing another document on the table. One final question. Emily looked at the parchment. This time, Jason chose a document bearing the Carter family seal. Her heart tightened. She recognized the symbol instantly. A crescent surrounded by 3 stars. The same emblem from the cabinet in the library. The same symbol on the pendant beneath her collar. Jason watched her carefully. You seem familiar with this seal. Emily kept her expression neutral. It is a historical royal emblem. Only a few families were ever permitted to use it. That is true. How would a maid know that? Emily looked toward Damien. The King Alpha had remained silent throughout the examination, but his eyes had never left her. He seemed less interested in the answers than in the reason she already knew them. Emily returned her attention to Jason. Because history leaves marks. Jason narrowed his eyes. Then tell us whose mark this is. The hall became completely silent. Emily looked at the silver crescent and 3 stars. For years, she had been taught to hide that symbol. Her grandmother had warned her that the Carter name could attract questions she was not prepared to answer. But now there was no safe answer left. She slowly touched the pendant beneath her collar. The oldest council member suddenly stood. His face changed as he looked from the document to Emily. That pendant, he whispered. Damien turned toward him. What about it? The old council member stared at Emily as if a forgotten memory had just returned. I have seen that symbol before. Emily's heart began to race. The room was silent again. And for the first time, she realized the council was no longer testing her knowledge. They were beginning to discover her identity. The oldest council member remained standing, his eyes fixed on the silver pendant beneath Emily's collar. That symbol belonged to the Carter family, he said quietly. The word seemed to change the temperature of the entire hall. Jason Whitmore looked from the pendant to Emily, his confidence fading. Damien stood from the royal platform, his attention fully focused on the elderly historian. Explain. The historian opened an ancient record and turned several fragile pages. The Carter family was once recognized as part of the original royal bloodline. Their name disappeared from the official records after the succession dispute. Emily felt every memory of her grandmother return at once. The old wooden table. The faded books. The quiet warnings. Never speak the family name. Never show the pendant. Never ask why the palace erased us. She had always believed those warnings belonged to another time. Now the past stood directly in front of her. Jason shook his head. There is no proof that this woman belongs to that family. Emily looked at him. I never said that I did. The historian turned another page. The records say the final Carter heir was a young girl who was taken away from the capital when the family lost its position. Jason looked sharply at Emily. How old was she? The historian checked the page. Very young. Emily's fingers tightened around the pendant. Damien noticed. Emily, he said quietly, what did your grandmother tell you about your family? Emily looked at him for a long moment. She had avoided this conversation for years, but there was no reason to hide anymore. She told me that our name had once mattered to this kingdom. Damien waited. And then? She said people became afraid of what our family represented. Jason stepped forward. That is not evidence. Emily remained calm. No. But this is. She pulled the silver pendant from beneath her collar and held it in her palm. The crescent and 3 stars caught the light from the chandeliers. The historian approached slowly, studying the symbol. This is the original Carter crest. A wave of whispers moved through the hall. Damien looked at Emily. Why did you come here? Emily's answer was simple. To work. He seemed surprised. Not to reclaim your family's position. No, not to seek the throne. Emily shook her head. I wanted a quiet life. Jason looked toward the council. Even if she is descended from the Carter line, that does not make her the ruler. Emily agreed. I do not want to rule. The historian closed the record book. That may not be your decision. Emily looked at him. What do you mean? The old man pointed toward an ancient passage written beneath the Carter family record. According to the oldest royal law, the bloodline is not confirmed by documents alone. The royal pack must recognize the heir. Damien's expression became serious. And how is that done? The historian looked toward the great hall beyond the council chamber. There is an ancient recognition ceremony. Jason immediately objected. That tradition has not been used in generations. Because there has been no confirmed Carter heir in generations, the historian replied. Emily stood quietly as the meaning settled over her. She had spent years trying to escape a name she barely understood. Now that name had followed her into the center of the kingdom. Damien stepped down from the royal platform and stopped beside her. You do not have to accept this, he said. Emily looked at the pendant in her hand. Then she looked toward the great doors of the hall. If I refuse, everyone will continue believing the wrong story. Damien nodded. Then we let the truth speak for itself. The doors opened, revealing the vast great hall beyond. Members of the royal pack were already gathering. Emily took one slow breath and walked forward. For the first time in her life, she was not walking away from her family's past. She was walking toward it. The great doors of Blackwood Palace opened before Emily, revealing the vast great hall beyond. Hundreds of members of the royal pack had gathered beneath the silver banners, their voices fading as they noticed the quiet maid walking beside the King Alpha. Emily wore the same simple gray uniform she had worn every day, but the small silver pendant now rested openly against her collar. Damien walked several steps behind her, giving her space rather than placing himself between her and the council. The ancient recognition ceremony had not been performed for generations, and nobody in the hall seemed certain what would happen. Emily could feel every pair of eyes following her. She reminded herself of her grandmother's words. Never seek power. Let the truth reveal itself. The oldest historian stepped toward the center of the hall and placed the ancient Carter seal upon a polished stone table. The law is simple, he announced. If the bloodline is genuine, the royal pack will recognize it. Jason Whitmore stood among the senior council members, his expression skeptical. And if they do not? The historian looked at him. Then the matter ends. Emily stepped forward. The hall became silent. She stood beside the silver seal without touching it. For several seconds, nothing happened. A few members of the council exchanged uncertain glances. Jason's expression brightened. Perhaps this has gone far enough. Damien remained silent. Emily did not defend herself. She simply looked at the ancient seal and then at the people surrounding her. She had spent years being told that her family's history was dangerous. Now she wondered if the real danger had been allowing fear to decide what the truth was worth. An elderly member of the royal pack stepped forward. He looked at Emily's pendant, then slowly lowered his head. Another followed. Emily's eyes widened. A third person stepped forward. Then a fourth. One by one, members of the oldest royal families began kneeling in formal recognition. The movement spread through the hall like a quiet wave. Soon, rows of the royal pack were kneeling across the marble floor. Emily stood completely still, overwhelmed by the sight. She had expected questions. She had expected doubt. She had never expected this. Jason remained standing. He looked around the hall, then toward Damien. Your Majesty, this cannot be accepted without further review. Damien looked at him calmly. The law has spoken. Jason shook his head. A tradition from centuries ago should not determine the present. Damien replied, then perhaps the council should have preserved the law before questioning its authority. Jason fell silent. Emily looked at Damien. Their eyes met across the quiet hall. He was not smiling. He was not celebrating. He simply appeared certain that the moment belonged to her. The oldest historian raised his voice. The royal pack has recognized the Carter bloodline. The words echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers. Emily closed her eyes for one brief moment. When she opened them, Jason was still standing. He looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and resistance. "You may have their recognition," he said, "but you do not command me." Emily did not answer. She looked toward the rows of kneeling members, then toward the King Alpha. Damien remained standing, watching her carefully. The entire hall seemed to wait for what she would do next. Emily had never wanted to command anyone. But now the ancient law had placed a decision in her hands, and everyone in the room was waiting for her first command. Jason Whitmore's words hung in the great hall. "You may have their recognition, but you do not command me." No one moved. The royal pack remained on their knees across the polished marble floor, while Emily stood beneath the silver banners with the ancient pendant resting against her collar. She looked toward Jason, then at the people who had recognized her family. She could feel the weight of the moment, but she refused to let pride make the decision for her. Damien watched silently from several steps away. His expression gave nothing away. He was the King Alpha, yet he had chosen not to answer for her. This was her moment. The oldest historian stepped forward. The ancient law recognizes the Carter heir. A recognized heir may issue one command during the ceremony, and the royal pack must acknowledge it. Jason looked toward the council. "That law is symbolic." The historian shook his head. "It has never been symbolic." Emily's heart beat faster. She had spent her entire life avoiding the power attached to her family name. Now everyone was asking her to use it. She looked around the great hall. Some faces showed curiosity. Others showed uncertainty. The servants stood near the doors, watching quietly. Emily remembered what it felt like to be ignored, to be spoken over, to be treated as though her thoughts did not matter because of the uniform she wore. She could have used this moment to make everyone feel what she had felt. Instead, she remembered her grandmother's voice. "Power tells you what you can do. Character tells you what you should do." Emily took one slow breath. Then she spoke. "Kneel." Her voice was quiet. The word traveled through the enormous hall with surprising clarity. Jason remained standing for a moment, his expression frozen between disbelief and hesitation. Then the ancient law took effect. He slowly lowered himself to one knee. Around him, the remaining members of the royal council followed, joining the royal pack in formal recognition. The great hall became completely still. Emily looked at the rows of people before her, but there was no satisfaction in her expression. She had not wanted their fear. She had wanted them to understand that her position did not make her better than anyone else. Damien remained standing. Emily turned toward him. For a moment, neither spoke. The King Alpha walked down the marble steps and stopped in front of her. "You could have commanded anything," he said. Emily looked at him calmly. "I know. And you chose that? Because recognition means nothing if it creates another hierarchy of cruelty." Damien studied her for several seconds. Then his expression softened. "You are not what I thought you were." Emily gave a faint smile. "Neither are you." Damien looked around the hall at the people kneeling in silence. Then he lowered himself onto one knee before her, not because the ancient law required him to, but because he chose to show respect. Emily's eyes widened. The King Alpha, the most powerful man in the royal pack, had made his decision freely. Damien looked up at her. "I do not kneel because you are above me," he said. "I kneel because you reminded all of us that power means nothing without dignity." Emily looked across the great hall. For years, she had been afraid of what her family's name might bring. Now she understood that the name itself was never the source of her strength. It was the choice she made when everyone finally gave her the power to choose. And for the first time, the woman everyone had called a maid stood in the center of the royal hall without hiding who she was. The great hall remained quiet long after Damien rose from one knee. Emily stood beneath the silver banners, still wearing the simple grey uniform that had once made everyone overlook her. Yet nothing about the way people looked at her was the same anymore. The royal pack had recognized her bloodline. Jason Whitmore had accepted the ancient command. And the King Alpha had chosen to kneel before her, not because anyone had forced him, but because he understood what the moment represented. Emily looked toward the servants near the doors. They were still watching with uncertainty, as though they expected the rules of the palace to change around them overnight. Emily understood that feeling. She had spent weeks moving through these halls believing that her position defined what she was allowed to say. Now she had the opportunity to change that. She turned toward the council. "I do not want a throne," she said. A few members looked surprised. "Then what do you want?" Damien asked. Emily took a slow breath. "I want people to be heard before they are judged." The words were simple, but they carried through the entire hall. She asked that palace servants receive fair treatment, proper rest, and the ability to bring concerns to the council without fear of being dismissed because of their position. She asked that royal laws be reviewed when they treated status as more important than character. She asked that the history of the Carter family be restored accurately, without turning her name into another reason for division. Damien listened carefully. Then he looked toward the council. "You heard her." Jason Whitmore remained quiet. The man who had once told Emily to remember where she belonged now stood among the same council members who had witnessed her recognition. He finally lowered his head. "The council will review the laws." Emily looked at him. "Not for me." Jason raised his eyes. "Then for whom?" Emily glanced toward the servants. "For everyone." Damien's expression softened. The decision had become larger than Emily's family name. It was about what the palace would become after the ceremony ended. Over the following weeks, changes spread through Blackwood Palace. Servants received clearer schedules and fairer compensation. Council members were required to review policies that affected palace workers. The old Carter records were restored to the royal archive. Emily was offered a private residence and a formal royal title, but she declined both. She kept a quieter room near the eastern wing, close to the same corridors she had once cleaned before sunrise. One morning, Damien found her there, standing beside the windows and watching the first light reach the palace gardens. "You could have taken everything," he said. Emily smiled gently. "I never wanted everything." Damien stood beside her. "Then what did you want?" Emily looked toward the servants beginning their morning work. "A life where people could see me without deciding my worth first." Damien was silent for a moment. "And now?" Emily looked at the silver pendant resting against her collar. "Now I can help make that possible for someone else." The King Alpha nodded. They stood together in the quiet morning light, no longer separated by the old assumptions that had defined their first meeting. Emily had once entered the palace hoping nobody would notice her. Now the entire royal pack knew her name, yet she remained the same woman who had chosen humility when she finally gained power. The palace had changed because she had been given one command, but the kingdom changed because she chose what to do after everyone obeyed. And that was the truth no crown could ever teach. Real authority is not measured by how many people you can make kneel, but by how many people you help stand with dignity.